Before we dive into this deeply personal story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This testimony contains mature themes and real-life consequences that many have faced. Enjoy the journey, and remember, every choice has a price. My name is Marlene, and I'm about to tell you something that will probably make you uncomfortable. Hell, it makes me uncomfortable, and I've been living with it for 20 years. But maybe that's the point. Maybe discomfort is exactly what we need when we talk about the choices that define us. I'm sitting here in Dr. Patterson's office, and my hands won't stop shaking. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps, and that antiseptic smell. God, I hate that smell. It takes me right back to another clinic, another day, another version of myself that I barely recognize anymore. Mrs. Coleman, Dr. Patterson says, sliding my chart across his desk. His voice is gentle, but his eyes hold something that I've seen before. Pity, maybe. Or judgment. I can never tell the difference anymore. The paper crinkles as I grip it tighter. At 45, you'd think I'd have learned to control my nerves by now. But some things never get easier. Some truths never stop cutting. The results are back from your biopsy, he continues, and I feel that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same knot I felt 20 years ago when I sat in a different chair, in a different office, making a different choice. Except this time, I don't get to choose. It's malignant, isn't it? The words slip out before I can stop them. I already know the answer. I've known it in my bones for weeks now. The same way I knew 20 years ago that the path I was choosing would lead me here eventually. Dr. Patterson nods slowly. Uterine cancer, stage 2. We caught it relatively early, but he pauses, searching for the right words. Given your medical history, the treatment options are complicated. My medical history. Such a clinical way to describe the wreckage of 2 decades. Such a neat, sanitized phrase for the choice that destroyed everything I thought I wanted in life. I remember the exact moment it all started. July 15th, 2004. I was 25, sitting in my tiny apartment in Boston, staring at a plastic stick with 2 pink lines. 2 lines that felt like prison bars, trapping me in a future I wasn't ready for. Garrett was passed out on my couch, still drunk from the night before, and I was holding this test, thinking about my career, my plans, my perfectly mapped out life. I thought I was so smart back then. I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought one small decision, one quick procedure would just ... erase the problem. Like deleting a file from a computer. Clean, simple, forgotten. But here's what they don't tell you in those sterile counseling sessions. Some things can't be erased. Some choices follow you for the rest of your life, growing heavier with each passing year, until you're carrying so much weight you can barely breathe. Mrs. Coleman? Dr. Patterson's voice pulls me back to the present. Are you all right? Am I all right? I want to laugh, but it would come out as a sob. I've spent 20 years pretending to be all right. 20 years building a life on the foundation of a lie I told myself, that what I did was just a medical procedure, nothing more, that the consequences would be temporary, that I could move on. But moving on is a luxury reserved for people who don't wake up every morning remembering the sound of that machine, who don't count the years, months, and days since they made the choice that would define everything that came after. I look at Dr. Patterson, this kind man who has no idea he's about to witness the final chapter of a story that began in another doctor's office with another kind of procedure. The irony isn't lost on me. The same organ I denied its purpose 20 years ago is now trying to kill me. When can we start treatment? I ask, because that's what you're supposed to say. That's what brave people say. But inside, I'm thinking about justice, about punishment, about whether some sins are too heavy to ever really forgive. Dr. Patterson starts talking about chemotherapy and radiation, about survival rates and treatment timelines. But all I can think about is that girl I used to be, so sure she was making the right choice, so confident that life would just continue as planned. If I could go back and tell her what I know now. But that's another luxury I don't get. We don't get do-overs in this life. We get consequences, and mine are finally catching up with me. The appointment ends, and I walk out into the bright afternoon sun, clutching appointment cards and treatment pamphlets. But all I really carry with me is the weight of knowing that this story started 20 years ago, in a place I've tried so hard to forget. And now I'm going to tell you everything. 20 years feels like a lifetime, but some moments are burned into your memory so clearly they might as well have happened yesterday. I can still see that girl. I was 25, fresh out of college, working at a marketing firm in downtown Boston. I thought I had the world figured out. My apartment was a cramped studio on Beacon Hill that cost half my salary, but I didn't care. It was mine. The walls were covered with my college degree, inspirational quotes I'd printed from the internet, and a 5-year plan I'd mapped out in colorful markers. By 30, I'd be a senior account manager. By 35, I'd have my own agency. Marriage and kids were penciled in somewhere after career success. Neat little checkboxes to mark off when the time was right. Garrett wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to be temporary, a bartender with gorgeous eyes and a motorcycle who made me feel wild and unpredictable. He was everything my carefully constructed life wasn't. Spontaneous, reckless, exciting. We'd been dating for 8 months, if you could call it dating. It was more like a series of late nights and hungover mornings, stolen moments between his shifts and my deadlines. I remember the morning I took that test like it happened 5 minutes ago. Garrett had stayed over after another one of his gigs. He played guitar in some band that performed at dive bars around Cambridge. He was snoring on my pull-out couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, smelling like cigarettes and cheap beer. I'd been feeling off for weeks. Tired, nauseous, emotional in ways that didn't make sense. My period was late, but I kept telling myself it was stress. I was working on the Pemberton account, trying to prove myself worthy of a promotion. I was living on coffee and ambition, sleeping 4 hours a night. Of course, my body was acting strange. But that morning, staring at those 2 pink lines, all my rationalizations crumbled. I sat on the edge of my bathtub for what felt like hours, holding that test, watching Garrett sleep through my crisis. This was not part of the plan. This was not supposed to happen. I was careful most of the time. We were careful most of the time. But most of the time isn't enough, is it? When Garrett finally woke up around noon, I was sitting at my tiny kitchen table, still in my pajamas, the test hidden in my bathroom drawer like evidence of a crime. "Morning, beautiful," he mumbled, shuffling to my coffee maker. "Why do you look like someone died?" I almost laughed at how close he was to the truth. Someone was about to die, in a way. The version of myself I'd spent 25 years building was about to be erased by 8 weeks of cellular division I never asked for. I didn't tell him that day, or the next. I kept going to work, kept pretending everything was normal, kept staring at my 5-year plan on the wall, and wondering how a baby would fit into those neat, colorful timelines. It wouldn't, of course. Not with Garrett as the father. Not with my career just starting. Not with my studio apartment and my student loans and my carefully balanced budget that barely covered rent and groceries. I started researching online late at night when Garrett wasn't there. I read about options, about procedures, about women who'd made this choice and moved on with their lives. The websites were clinical, reassuring, quick procedure, minimal recovery time, return to normal activities within a few days. Normal activities. As if normal was something you could just return to after stopping a heartbeat. But I convinced myself it was the right choice. The only choice. I was too young, too unprepared, too focused on building the life I'd planned since I was 18. A baby would ruin everything. My career, my independence, my future. And Garrett? He could barely take care of himself, let alone a child. I made the appointment on a Thursday morning, calling from my office bathroom during my lunch break. The receptionist was matter of fact, professional. Saturday at 9 a.m. Bring someone to drive you home. Don't eat after midnight on Friday. Simple instructions for something that would change everything. I finally told Garrett on Friday night. We were in bed and he was tracing patterns on my bare shoulder, talking about his band's next gig. The words just spilled out of me like a confession. I'm pregnant and I'm taking care of it tomorrow. He stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was traffic outside my window. Taking care of it? He repeated. I have an appointment. It's handled. You don't need to worry about anything. He sat up, running his hands through his hair. Jesus, Marlene. When did you? How long have you known? A week? Maybe 2? It doesn't matter now. What I expected was relief. What I got was something I couldn't read in his expression. Not quite sadness, but not relief either. Something that looked almost like loss. Do you want me to come with you? He asked. I should have said yes. I should have asked for support, for someone to hold my hand through what I knew would be difficult. But I was determined to handle it alone, the way I handled everything else in my life. No, I said. I've got it covered. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Garrett breathe beside me. I kept thinking about the appointment, about moving forward with my life, about getting back to normal. I thought it would be like ripping off a bandage, painful for a moment, then forgotten. I had no idea I was about to make a choice that would echo through every single day of the next 20 years. Saturday morning came too fast and too slow at the same time. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., staring at my alarm clock, waiting for the teal to be time to get up. My appointment was at 9, and I needed to be there by 8:30. I'd mapped out the drive 3 times, even though I'd been to that part of the city before. The clinic was in a nondescript building on Commonwealth Avenue, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. I'd driven past it dozens of times without ever really seeing it. Now I couldn't stop seeing it. The plain brick facade, the small sign that could have been for any medical office, the narrow entrance with its heavy glass door. I showered and dressed carefully, like I was preparing for a job interview. Black slacks, a blue button-down shirt, my good shoes, professional, put together, in control. If I looked the part, maybe I'd feel it too. Garrett had offered again to drive me, but I'd declined. This was my decision, my responsibility. I would handle it the way I handled everything else, alone and efficiently. The waiting room was smaller than I'd expected. Beige walls, generic landscape paintings, chairs that had seen better days. There were 5 other women there when I arrived, all of us avoiding eye contact, all of us pretending to read magazines we weren't actually seeing. I filled out paperwork. Medical history, emergency contact, insurance information, consent forms with language that was both clinical and terrifying. I signed my name over and over, each signature feeling like I was agreeing to something bigger than I understood. Marlene Foster? A nurse called my name, and my stomach dropped. This was it, the point of no return. The consultation room was even smaller than the waiting room. Dr. Richards was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired hands. She went through the procedure, the risks, the recovery process. Her voice was gentle but matter of fact, like she was explaining how to change a tire. Do you have any questions? She asked when she finished. I had 1,000 questions, but none I could actually voice. Questions like, will I regret this? Will it hurt more than you're telling me? Will I still be me when it's over? Instead, I just shook my head. I need to ask, are you certain this is what you want to do? You can change your mind at any point, even up until the procedure begins. I'm sure, I said, because that's what you say, because uncertainty wasn't an option I'd allowed myself. The procedure room was blindingly white. Everything was sterile, efficient, designed to make this as clinical as possible. I changed into a hospital gown that tied in the back and lay down on a table that was too narrow and too cold. Dr. Richards appeared beside me, along with a nurse whose name I immediately forgot. They spoke in calm, professional voices about what they were doing, but their words seemed to come from very far away. I focused on a water stain on the ceiling tile above me, a small brown mark that looked like a bird in flight. The medication made everything fuzzy around the edges. I could hear the machine humming, could feel pressure and movement, but it was like it was happening to someone else. I floated above it all, detached, watching this clinical procedure being performed on some other woman who'd made some other choice. It was over in less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to erase 8 weeks. 10 minutes to get back to my 5-year plan. 10 minutes that felt like both forever and no time at all. In recovery, I lay on another narrow bed, waiting for the medication to wear off. The nurse brought me crackers and ginger ale, checked my vital signs, asked how I was feeling. Fine, I told her. I felt fine. Empty, but fine. You can get dressed when you're ready, she said. Someone's picking you up? I nodded, even though I was driving myself home. I lied on the forms about having a ride, I'd lied about a lot of things that morning. Getting dressed was harder than I expected. My hands were shaking and my legs felt unsteady. But I managed, because I always manage. I gathered my purse, my keys, my carefully constructed composure. The drive home was a blur. I remember stopping at a red light and suddenly crying so hard I couldn't see. I remember pulling over and sitting in my car in some random parking lot, sobbing into my steering wheel. I remember feeling hollowed out, like something essential had been scooped out of me and thrown away. But I also remembered why I'd made this choice. My career, my future, my carefully planned life that was back on track now. The relief was there, underneath the sadness. The relief of not having to figure out how to be a mother at 25 with a boyfriend who played guitar in dive bars and a bank account that barely covered rent. I was free. I was back to being just Marlene, with just my own life to worry about. I could focus on work, on moving up, on becoming the woman I'd planned to. When I got home, Garrett was waiting on my front steps with coffee and bagels from the place down the street. "How are you?" he asked, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. He looked like he hadn't slept. "I'm fine," I said, "because that's what you say it's done. Everything's back to normal now." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Nothing felt normal. Nothing felt the same. Something had shifted inside me. Some fundamental piece of who I was had been altered in that white room with the humming machine. I just didn't know yet how much. The thing about making a choice you believe is right is that you expect relief to follow. You expect to wake up the next morning feeling lighter, freer, more certain about the path ahead. What I got instead was a silence so loud it felt like screaming. The first few days after were exactly what the pamphlets had promised. Minimal physical discomfort, back to normal activities within 48 hours. I returned to work on Monday like nothing had happened. I answered emails, attended meetings, pitched ideas for the Pemberton account. On the outside, I was the same ambitious 25-year-old I'd always been. But inside, something had shifted. There was a hollow space where certainty used to live, an emptiness that had nothing to do with the procedure and everything to do with the weight of what I'd done. Garrett tried to talk about it once, about a week later. We were having dinner at this little Italian place we used to go to, and he kept glancing at me like I might break. "Are you okay?" he asked for the third time that night. "I mean, really okay?" "I'm fine," I said, cutting my chicken parmigiana into smaller and smaller pieces. "Why wouldn't I be okay?" "I don't know. You just seem different." Different. That was the word, wasn't it? Not worse, not better, just fundamentally altered in a way I couldn't explain even to myself. "I'm the same person I was 2 weeks ago," I lied. "Actually, I'm better. I can focus on my career now. I can focus on us." But even as I said it, I knew there was no us anymore. Not really. Garrett had become a reminder of the choice I'd made. And every time I looked at him, I felt that hollow space expand a little more. We lasted another month. The breakup was mutual, quiet, almost anticlimactic. He was moving to California anyway, he said. His band had gotten a gig in Los Angeles, a real opportunity. We both knew it was an excuse, but we took it gratefully. "Take care of yourself, Marlene," he said when he came to get his things from my apartment. He hugged me goodbye, and for a moment, I wanted to tell him everything I was feeling. The confusion, the emptiness, the strange grief I couldn't name or understand. Instead, I said, "You too. Good luck with the music." After he left, I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. I stayed late every night, came in early every morning, volunteered for every project and presentation. The Pemberton account became my obsession, my chance to prove that I'd made the right choice, that sacrificing everything else for my career had been worth it. And it worked, for a while. I got the promotion, then another one. By the time I was 28, I was exactly where I'd planned to be professionally. Senior account manager, corner office, respect from my colleagues. My 5-year plan was right on track. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my success, I found myself counting. Not days or weeks, but something else entirely. If I hadn't made that choice, the baby would be walking now, would be saying first words, would be ... stop. I learned to stop those thoughts before they could take root. I started dating again, carefully this time. Professional men with career goals that matched mine. Men who understood that work came first, that building a life required sacrifice and focus. Men who didn't remind me of dive bars and motorcycle rides and choices made in white rooms with humming machines. There was David, a lawyer who worked downtown. We dated for 6 months, neat dinner dates, and carefully planned weekends. He was safe, predictable, exactly what I thought I needed. When he asked me to move in with him, I said yes because it seemed like the logical next step. But even with David, especially with David, the hollow space remained. He would talk about our future together, marriage, maybe kids someday when our careers were more established, and I would smile and nod while something inside me recoiled. The first panic attack came on a Tuesday night in October. I was working late, alone in the office, when suddenly I couldn't breathe. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and I felt like I was drowning in that antiseptic smell, even though I was nowhere near a medical facility. I called it stress. Too much work, too much pressure. David suggested I take a vacation, maybe see someone about anxiety management, but I knew it wasn't stress. It was something deeper, something that had been growing in that hollow space for months. The panic attacks became more frequent. Random moments when my body would remember what my mind was trying to forget. I learned to hide them, to breathe through them, to wait for them to pass. I became an expert at excusing myself to bathroom stalls and supply closets, anywhere I could fall apart in private. I started having dreams, not nightmares exactly, but strange, vivid dreams about children I'd never met. A little girl with dark hair who looked like me at 5. A toddler reaching up to be picked up. Always just out of reach, always just beyond the edge of understanding. I would wake up from these dreams feeling like I'd lost something important, though I could never remember exactly what. David would ask if I was okay, and I'd lie and say it was just work stress, just the pressure of the upcoming campaign launch. By my 29th birthday, I had everything I'd planned for. The career, the relationship, the apartment, the financial security. I should have been happy. I should have been satisfied with the life I'd built on the foundation of that choice I'd made in the White Room. Instead, I felt like I was living someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin, pretending to be satisfied with achievements that felt increasingly meaningless. The hollow space inside me had grown so large that sometimes I wondered if there was anything left of the real me at all. And the worst part was, I still believed I'd made the right choice. I still told myself that everything I had was worth what I'd given up. I just couldn't figure out why it felt so much like punishment. 3 years later, I met Thomas at a conference in Chicago. He was everything Garrett wasn't. Stable, thoughtful, the kind of man who planned vacations 6 months in advance and never forgot anniversaries. He worked in finance, wore pressed shirts, and had a savings account that could cover actual emergencies. When he smiled at me across that hotel ballroom during the networking mixer, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: safety. Our courtship was methodical, mature. He took me to nice restaurants and asked thoughtful questions about my work. He listened when I talked about my goals, nodded approvingly when I mentioned my promotion timeline. He didn't drink too much or stay out too late or make me feel like I was dating a teen. When he proposed after 18 months, it was exactly what you'd expect from Thomas. A perfect diamond in a perfect setting, presented during a perfect dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. I said yes because it made sense. Because he was the kind of man you were supposed to marry when you were 31 and had your life together. The wedding was small, elegant, everything my mother had dreamed of for me. I wore my grandmother's pearls and carried white roses. Thomas cried when I walked down the aisle, and I felt a flutter of something that might have been happiness or relief. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. For the first year of marriage, I almost believed I'd figured it out. We bought a house in Newton, a colonial with good bones and a 2-car garage. We hosted dinner parties for our colleagues and took weekend trips to Vermont. I kept climbing the corporate ladder while Thomas built his client base. We were the picture of young professional success, but the hollow space inside me remained. Even with a wedding ring on my finger and joint bank accounts and someone to share the electric bill, Thomas was wonderful, attentive, supportive, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. So why did I still feel like I was playing a role in someone else's life? The conversation about children started gradually, the way these conversations do. Comments about our friends' babies, observations about the good schools in our neighborhood, casual mentions of when we have kids during dinner table discussions about the future. I found myself nodding along, making appropriate responses, but inside, something was twisting. The idea of pregnancy, of carrying a child, of giving birth, it made that hollow space ache in ways I couldn't explain. Not just fear, but something deeper, something that felt like guilt. I think I'd like to wait a few more years, I told Thomas when he brought it up directly. My career is really taking off right now. The Jameson account is huge, and if I handle it right, I could make partner by 35. He nodded, understanding. That was Thomas, always reasonable, always willing to accommodate my timeline. Of course, we've got time. I just think you'd be an amazing mother. An amazing mother. The words hit me like a physical blow, though I couldn't let it show. How could I be an amazing mother when I'd already proven I was capable of the opposite? How could I trust myself with a child when I'd made the choice to ... Stop. Don't go there. But by the time I turned 33, the pressure was getting harder to deflect. My sister had just had her second baby, and every family gathering became an exercise in dodging questions about when Thomas and I would start our family. As if we weren't already a family. As if what we had wasn't enough. Thomas started leaving parenting magazines on the coffee table, forwarding me articles about maternal age and fertility windows. Nothing pushy, nothing demanding, just gentle reminders that time was passing, that if we wanted children, we should probably start thinking seriously about it. One night in bed, he rolled over and looked at me with such hope in his eyes that I felt my heart crack a little. "Marlene," he said softly, "I know your career is important. I know you want to wait. But I'm 35. You're 33. Don't you think it's time?" I stared at the ceiling, searching for words that wouldn't reveal the truth. That the thought of being pregnant terrified me in ways I couldn't name. That every time I imagined holding a baby, I felt like a fraud. That some part of me believed I'd forfeited the right to motherhood 8 years ago in a white room with a humming machine. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Let's try." The relief on his face was so pure, so genuinely happy, that I almost convinced myself I meant it. Maybe this was how I'd fix the hollow space inside me. Maybe this was how I'd become whole again. Maybe carrying a child would somehow erase the choice I'd made before, would balance the cosmic ledger I'd been keeping in my head. We started trying that night. Thomas was gentle, reverent, like he was handling something precious and fragile. Afterward, he held me close and whispered about the future we were creating together. Our children would have his eyes and my determination. They'd be smart, successful, wanted. That was the key word, wasn't it? This child would be wanted, planned for, celebrated. Everything that other pregnancy 8 years ago hadn't been. For 3 months, I let myself believe it would be that simple. That wanting something badly enough could undo the past. That love could overcome biology. That intention could overcome consequence. When I missed my first period, I took a pregnancy test with shaking hands, just like I had 8 years before. But this time, when those 2 pink lines appeared, I cried with something that felt like joy. Thomas found me in the bathroom, holding the test, tears streaming down my face. "Happy tears?" he asked, and I nodded because in that moment, they were. In that moment, I believed I was being given a second chance. We were so careful with this pregnancy. Prenatal vitamins, doctor's appointments, pregnancy books stacked on every nightstand. Thomas would put his hand on my still flat belly and talk to the baby about all the adventures they'd have together. For 8 weeks, I let myself plan. For 8 weeks, I believed I deserved this happiness. The bleeding started on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday, it was over. "These things happen," Dr. Morrison said gently. "Early pregnancy loss is more common than people think. There's usually nothing you could have done differently." But I knew better. I knew exactly what I'd done differently 8 years ago. And now, I was paying the price. Thomas held me while I cried, promised we'd try again. that this was just a setback. He couldn't understand why I seemed to be grieving not just for the baby we'd lost, but for something much older and deeper. How could I tell him that this felt less like a random tragedy and more like justice finally catching up with me? We tried again, of course. Thomas was convinced the first loss was just bad luck, one of those statistics doctors warn you about, but that happened to other people. His optimism was infectious, and for a while, I let myself believe him. Maybe the universe wasn't keeping score. Maybe one mistake didn't doom me to a lifetime of punishment. The second pregnancy came 4 months later. This time, I didn't tell Thomas right away. I took 3 different tests, waited a week, took 3 more. When I finally showed him the positive result, I could see him trying to contain his excitement, trying to be cautious after what had happened before. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said, but his eyes were already bright with hope. No pressure, no stress, just ... Cautious optimism. I made it to 10 weeks that time, long enough to hear a heartbeat at the first ultrasound, long enough to see that tiny flicker on the grainy screen that made Thomas squeeze my hand so tight it hurt, long enough to start believing that maybe I was wrong about cosmic justice, about punishment, about the price of choices made in white rooms. The bleeding started on a Sunday morning while we were having coffee and reading the newspaper. By Monday evening, there was no heartbeat to find on the ultrasound screen. "I'm so sorry, doctor," Morrison said, and I could see her running through the standard comforting phrases in her head. "Sometimes these things just happen twice. It doesn't mean anything is wrong with you." But Thomas's face when we left that appointment, I'd never seen him look so lost. He'd been planning nursery colors, researching preschools, calculating college funds. He'd already been a father in his mind, and now he was grieving a child he'd never get to hold. "We can keep trying," he said that night, lying in the dark beside me. "Dr. Morrison said there's no medical reason we can't have a healthy pregnancy. No medical reason she could find." But I was starting to see a pattern that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with mathematics. 1 pregnancy terminated, 2 pregnancies lost. The equation was becoming clear. The 3rd pregnancy happened 6 months later. I didn't tell Thomas until I was 12 weeks along, past the supposedly safe zone where losses become less likely. When I finally showed him the ultrasound photo, he stared at it like he was afraid it might disappear if he looked too long. "Third time's the charm," he said, but his voice was cautious now, guarded in a way it had never been before. We made it to 16 weeks that time, long enough to learn it was a girl. Long enough for Thomas to start calling her by name, Emma, after his grandmother. Long enough for him to buy a tiny Red Sox onesie that he hid in his sock drawer like a secret talisman. I lost her on a Thursday afternoon at work, doubled over in my office bathroom as everything I dared to hope for slipped away in waves of cramping pain. My assistant found me there 20 minutes later, called an ambulance, held my hand while EMTs loaded me onto a stretcher. Thomas met us at the hospital, still wearing his work clothes, his face white with panic. The doctors were efficient, professional, kind. They had procedures for this kind of thing, forms to fill out, medical terms that made the loss sound clinical and manageable. Incompetent cervix, they called it. A cruel name for what felt like a personal failure. They could fix it, they said. A simple procedure, a cervical circlage, would help me carry future pregnancies to term. Future pregnancy. Thomas nodded eagerly, asking questions about success rates and recovery times. But I was thinking about patterns, about punishment, about a debt that seemed to grow larger with each loss. That night, after Thomas had finally fallen asleep beside me, I lay in the dark doing math. One choice made at 25 had cost me 3 wanted pregnancies by 34. The equation was becoming impossible to ignore. The 4th pregnancy came 10 months later, after the cervical surgery. After months of vitamins and meditation and acupuncture and every fertility ritual I could find online, Thomas was cautiously hopeful, constantly monitoring my mood, treating me like I was made of glass. We made it to 20 weeks that time, long enough to have the anatomy scan, long enough to see tiny fingers and toes, and a perfect spine curved like a question mark. long enough for Thomas to start painting the nursery a soft yellow, because we'd decided to be surprised about the gender. I went into labor on a Saturday night. My body betrayed me again despite the surgery, despite the bed rest, despite everything we'd tried to make this pregnancy different. Thomas drove me to the hospital through empty streets, both of us knowing it was too early, way too early. They tried to stop the contractions, tried everything in their medical arsenal. But sometimes the body has made up its mind, and there's nothing science can do to argue with biology or justice, or whatever force was keeping this careful accounting of my choice. The baby lived for 4 hours, long enough for the NICU team to try their miracles, long enough for us to hold his tiny hand through the incubator walls, long enough for Thomas to whisper promises about baseball games and bicycle rides that would never come true. We named him Michael, after Thomas's father. We held a small funeral with white flowers and hymns I didn't know the words to. Thomas's family came, and mine, and everyone said the right things about God's plan and angels in heaven and how Michael was too perfect for this world. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about God's plan or angels or the randomness of biology. This was about a choice I'd made 9 years ago and a debt that kept compounding with interest. After Michael's funeral, I found Thomas in the nursery we'd never use, sitting in the rocking chair he'd assembled with such hope, holding that tiny red socks onesie in his hands. "I don't understand," he said, and his voice was broken in a way I'd never heard before. "What are we doing wrong? What are we being punished for?" Punished. He'd used the word I'd been thinking but never dared to say out loud. Because if this was punishment, then he was suffering for something I'd done long before I met him. He was paying the price for a choice that had nothing to do with him. For the first time in 9 years, I almost told him the truth. Almost confessed about that Saturday morning in a white room, about the choice that had started this chain of losses. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy as stones. Instead, I sat down beside him and cried for Michael, for Emma, for all the unnamed children we'd lost, and for the one I'd chosen to lose so many years ago. Thomas held me while I sobbed, thinking I was grieving only for our baby. He had no idea I was also mourning the woman I used to be. Before I learned that some choices follow you forever, growing heavier with each passing year. After Michael, something fundamental shifted between Thomas and me. Not just grief, we'd weathered that before, but something deeper and more corrosive. The space between us filled with unspoken accusations and careful silences, with conversations that stopped just short of the truth neither of us wanted to face. Thomas threw himself into research with the desperate intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible equation. Our dining room table disappeared under stacks of medical journals, fertility books, printouts from websites with names like recurrent pregnancy loss support and miracle babies after multiple miscarriages. He made spreadsheets, tracking my cycles, my temperature, my vitamin intake. He scheduled appointments with specialists, insisted on test after test. There has to be an explanation, he'd say, surrounded by his research at 2 in the morning. 4 losses isn't random. There's something we're missing, but every test came back normal. My hormones were fine. My uterine structure was normal. The cervical surgery had healed perfectly. Blood work showed no clotting disorders, no autoimmune issues, no genetic abnormalities. On paper, I was the picture of reproductive health. Unexplained recurrent pregnancy loss, Dr. Morrison finally labeled it the medical equivalent of throwing up her hands. Sometimes it just happens, even when everything looks perfect. Thomas refused to accept that diagnosis. He found new doctors, sought second and third opinions, dragged me to fertility clinics in Boston and New York, where specialists with impressive credentials ran the same tests and reached the same baffling conclusion. There was no medical reason I couldn't carry a healthy baby to term. But I was starting to understand that medical reasons weren't the only ones that mattered. Late at night, when Thomas was finally asleep, I'd lie awake doing the math that had become my obsession. 1 terminated pregnancy, 4 miscarriages. The numbers felt significant, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with justice. The 5th pregnancy happened despite our best efforts to take a break, to focus on healing, to stop trying so hard. I didn't tell Thomas when my period was late. I took the test alone, in the bathroom, at work, and stared at those familiar pink lines with something that felt more like dread than hope. This time, I made it to 24 weeks. The viability threshold, they called it. The point where medical intervention might save a baby born too early. Thomas was cautiously optimistic, carefully controlled in his excitement. We'd learned not to buy baby clothes, or paint nurseries, or make plans beyond the next doctor's appointment. But privately, I think we both started to believe this might be the one. 24 weeks was further than we'd ever made it. The baby was active, kicking strongly enough that Thomas could feel it through my belly. All the tests came back perfect. No genetic abnormalities, no signs of distress, no indication that this pregnancy would end like all the others. I went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my desk trying to focus on budget projection. The contractions started slow, manageable, easy to dismiss as Braxton Hicks. By evening, they were unmistakable. Thomas drove me to the hospital with the careful precision of someone who'd made this trip too many times before. We knew the route by heart, knew which parking garage was closest to labor and delivery, knew which nurses would be working the night shift. "It's too early," I kept saying. And Thomas kept assuring me that babies born at 24 weeks survived all the time, that medical technology could work miracles these days. But I knew better. I knew that some debts can't be negotiated with, some equations can't be solved with hope and medical intervention. Our daughter lived for 6 days, long enough for us to name her Sarah after my grandmother. Long enough for the NICU team to try everything in their arsenal, ventilators and feeding tubes and medication I couldn't pronounce. Long enough for us to take turns sitting beside her Isolette, reading to her from children's books we'd bought in the hospital gift shop, singing lullabies to a baby too small to open her eyes. When the end came, it was quiet. No alarms, no dramatic final moments, just a gradual slowing of the monitors until the lines went flat. And suddenly, the room was full of people in scrubs, speaking in gentle voices about organ donation and final arrangements. Thomas broke completely after Sarah. Not just sadness, but a fundamental collapse of the man I'd married. He stopped going to work, stopped shaving, stopped talking, except in single-word responses to direct questions. He'd sit in Sarah's room. We'd finally painted it pink, finally allowed ourselves that small hope, staring at the empty crib for hours. "I can't do this anymore," he said one morning, standing in the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, looking at me like I was a stranger. "I can't keep watching our children die. Our children. As if the babies we'd lost belonged to both of us equally. As if we'd both made the choices that led us here." The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. This good man suffering for sins that were mine alone. "Maybe we should take a break," I said. "See someone. A counselor or a break?" His laugh was bitter, hollow. "Marlene, we've lost 5 babies. 5. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand how fucked up that is?" I'd never heard Thomas swear before. In 3 years of marriage, through all our losses, he'd maintained his careful politeness, his reasonable tone. Hearing him curse felt like watching something sacred being desecrated. "There's something wrong?" he continued, and his voice was getting louder, more desperate. "With you, with us, with this whole situation, normal people don't lose 5 babies. There has to be a reason. A reason." He was so close to the truth, circling around it like a bird of prey. Part of me wanted to tell him then, to finally confess the choice I'd made 10 years ago, and let him understand why we were trapped in this endless cycle of loss. But looking at him, broken, desperate, aged beyond his 37 years, I knew the truth would destroy what little was left of us. How could I tell him that every dead baby was payment on a debt I'd incurred before we met? How could I explain that his suffering was collateral damage from a choice I'd made in a white room when I was 25 and stupid and so sure I knew what I wanted? Instead, I said nothing. I watched him pack a bag, watched him kiss my forehead with the mechanical affection of someone going through the motions of goodbye. He moved into his brother's house in Cambridge, claiming he needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next. But I knew he was really leaving because staying meant watching me fail again. Staying meant being complicit in whatever curse or punishment or cosmic justice had made our home a graveyard for the children we'd never get to raise. After Thomas left, I sat in Sarah's empty nursery, surrounded by all the evidence of our hope, the crib we'd finally assembled, the mobile with dancing bears, the rocking chair where I'd planned to nurse her back to health. 5 losses. The number felt significant, weighted with meaning I was finally ready to acknowledge. One choice made in a moment of panic and selfishness had cost me 5 wanted pregnancies and the love of the only man who'd ever made me feel safe. The debt was getting harder to ignore, and I was running out of ways to pay it. After Thomas left, the house felt like a mausoleum. Every room held evidence of our failed attempts at family, the nursery we'd painted and repainted, the baby books scattered across the coffee table, the fertility charts still taped to the refrigerator like accusation. I thought about selling the house, starting over somewhere without memories embedded in every wall. But running away felt like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I gave myself a week to fall apart. 7 days to cry until my eyes swelled shut, to drink wine for breakfast, to scream at the ceiling and demand answers from whatever cosmic force was keeping score of my failure. Then I picked myself up, because that's what I'd always done. I survived by moving forward, by finding solutions, by refusing to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. If traditional medicine couldn't explain my losses, I'd look elsewhere. I started with the internet, diving into forums and message boards where women shared stories of miracle pregnancies after years of loss. I read about women who'd tried everything: acupuncture, herbal supplements, elimination diets, meditation retreats. Some of them had eventually. Their stories became my lifeline. Dr. Chun's acupuncture clinic was in Chinatown, up 3 flights of narrow stairs above a restaurant that smelled like garlic and star anise. She was a tiny woman with gentle hands who listened to my entire history without judgment, nodding as I recounted each pregnancy, each loss, each test that had come back frustratingly normal. Western medicine looks at body like machine, she said, feeling for my pulse in ways that seemed more intuitive than scientific. But body is river. Energy must flow freely. When blocked, life cannot take hold. I didn't care if it was science or superstition. I went 3 times a week, lying still while she placed hair-thin needles in my wrists and ankles and abdomen, mapping out meridians that might hold the key to carrying a baby to term. Between sessions, I took herbs that tasted like dirt and promises, teas that were supposed to strengthen my kidney key and balance my reproductive energy. When acupuncture didn't produce immediate results, I found Dr. Martinez, a naturopath who believed my losses were caused by environmental toxins. She put me on a strict elimination diet. No gluten, no dairy, no processed food, no caffeine. My apartment became a temple of organic vegetables and supplements with names I couldn't pronounce. I replaced my cleaning products with vinegar and baking soda, threw out my makeup, and bought organic versions that cost 3 times as much. Your body is trying to tell you something, Dr. Martinez said during our weekly consultation. These losses aren't random. They're your system's way of rejecting pregnancies it knows aren't viable in your current toxic environment. It made sense in the way that desperate explanations always make sense when you need something to blame besides yourself. I followed her protocols religiously, tracking every symptom, every change in energy or mood. I got tested for heavy metals, food sensitivities, mold exposure, electromagnetic sensitivity. I spent thousands of dollars on supplements and organic groceries and water filtration systems. But 6 months later, when I got pregnant for the 6th time, I lost the baby at 8 weeks despite my purified environment and optimized nutrition. The cramping started on a Saturday morning while I was juicing organic kale, and by Sunday evening, it was over. Dr. Martinez attributed the loss to residual toxins still clearing from my system, but I could see doubt creeping into her confident explanation. We were running out of environmental factors to blame. That's when I found the support group. Recurrent pregnancy loss A Journey of Hope met every Tuesday evening in the basement of St. Catherine's Church in Newton. 12 folding chairs arranged in a circle, a box of tissues on a card table, and women who understood the specific pain of loving children they'd never get to hold. There was Jennifer, who'd lost 7 pregnancies before carrying twins to term at 41. Susan had endured 9 losses before her son was born healthy and perfect. Maria was on her 10th pregnancy after 12 miscarriages and 2 stillbirths, still believing this one might be different. "The doctors don't understand," said Catherine, a woman my age who'd been trying to have a baby for 8 years. "They want to treat us like machines that are broken. But this isn't about broken parts. This is about something deeper. For the first time in years, I felt understood." These women knew the weight of constant loss, the way grief accumulated in your bones until you carried it everywhere. They knew about the well-meaning friends who suggested adoption as if it were a simple alternative. The family members who wondered aloud if you were trying too hard. The medical professionals who spoke in statistics that felt meaningless when applied to your own shattered dreams. But even among these women who'd experienced unimaginable loss, my numbers stood out. 6 pregnancies, 6 losses. Most of the others had at least one success story to balance the failures. At least one child who'd made the journey worthwhile. I was the outlier, the one whose pattern defied even their experienced understanding of reproductive trauma. "Have you considered that maybe the universe is trying to tell you something?" Maria asked me after one particularly raw session where I'd finally shared my complete history. "Maybe there's something you need to resolve before you can move forward?" "Something I need to resolve." The words followed me home, echoed in my empty house, whispered accusations in the dark, because deep down I knew exactly what needed resolving. I knew the choice that had started this cascade of losses, the decision I'd made in a white room 11 years ago that had set this whole pattern in motion. But acknowledging that would mean accepting that Thomas was right, that there was a reason for our losses, something beyond random medical bad luck. It would mean admitting that my choices had consequences that extended far beyond what I'd imagined at 25. It would mean accepting that some debts can't be paid with herbs and acupuncture and organic vegetables. Some equations can't be solved with different doctors or new protocols or desperate faith in alternative medicine. Some punishments are designed to last a lifetime. After my 6th loss, I stopped going to the support group. I couldn't bear to see the hope in those women's eyes, the belief that the next pregnancy might be different. I was starting to understand that for some of us, hope was just another form of cruelty. I was 36 years old, divorced in all but paperwork, and I'd lost 6 babies in 6 years. The math was becoming impossible to ignore, and I was running out of ways to convince myself it was anything other than exactly what it looked like. Payment on a debt that grew larger every time I tried to cheat it. By 38, I had become a medical mystery that doctors discussed in hushed tones during case conferences. 6 unexplained pregnancy losses with no identifiable cause had made me the subject of papers and specialist consultation. My file was thick with test results, ultrasound images, and baffled medical opinions from some of the best reproductive endocrinologists in Boston. Dr. Sarah Hoffman was my 7th specialist, recommended by a colleague who'd heard about my case through the medical grapevine. She was younger than the others, maybe 42, with the confident bearing of someone who'd built her reputation on solving impossible puzzles. Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from grateful patients, photos of babies born after years of struggle, testament to miracles she'd helped orchestrate. "I've reviewed your entire file," she said during our first consultation, spreading my medical history across her desk like tarot cards that might reveal hidden truths. 6 losses, all occurring between 8 and 24 weeks. No chromosomal abnormalities detected, no identifiable maternal factors. It's quite remarkable, actually. Remarkable. As if my suffering were an interesting academic exercise rather than the wreckage of a life I'd tried to build on a foundation of lies. "The other doctors have said it's unexplained," I told her. "That sometimes these things just happen." Dr. Hoffman shook her head. "I don't believe in unexplained when it comes to patterns this consistent. There's always a reason. We just haven't looked in the right place yet. She ordered tests I'd never heard of, analyzed tissue samples from my most recent loss with techniques that hadn't been available during my earlier pregnancy. She mapped my reproductive anatomy with imaging so detailed it felt invasive, like having my most private failures broadcast in high definition. I want to schedule a hysteroscopy, she said after reviewing the results. I need to see inside your uterine cavity directly. There might be scarring or structural abnormalities that aren't showing up on conventional imaging. The procedure was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I took the day off work to spend it in another medical facility, in another gown that tied in the back, breathing another version of that antiseptic air that always took me back to that first white room 13 years ago. The hysteroscopy required local anesthesia, a thin camera threaded through my cervix to explore the space where all those babies had tried and failed to grow. I watched the monitor as Dr. Hoffman navigated the internal landscape of my reproductive system. Her commentary, a mixture of medical terminology and thoughtful murmurs. "There," she said suddenly, and her voice held the satisfaction of someone finding a long-lost puzzle piece. "Do you see this scarring pattern along the posterior wall?" I saw shadows and textures that meant nothing to me, but Dr. Hoffman saw the story my body had been hiding for 13 years. "This is adhesion formation consistent with uterine trauma," she continued, adjusting the camera angle, "significant enough to interfere with implantation and early pregnancy development. When did you have your last surgical procedure?" "Last surgical procedure." The words hit me like ice water, and suddenly I was 25 again, signing consent forms in a different clinic, trusting different doctors to handle something I thought would be simple and forgettable. It was a long time ago, I managed, before my marriage, before I started trying to get pregnant. "What kind of procedure?" Her voice was gentle but persistent, the tone of a detective who'd found the crucial clue. The truth sat in my throat like a stone. For 13 years, I'd carried this secret, convinced that what I'd done was separate from what was happening to me now. But looking at the monitor, seeing the evidence of old damage mapped out in clinical detail, I couldn't maintain the fiction anymore. "A termination," I whispered. "When I was 25. Dr. Hoffman nodded, not with judgment, but with the satisfaction of a mystery finally solved. "And was there any mention of complications at the time? Excessive bleeding, infection, unusual pain?" I tried to remember those days after the procedure, but I'd worked so hard to forget them. There had been pain, I thought, more than the pamphlets had promised, and bleeding that lasted longer than expected. But I'd convinced myself it was normal, part of the healing process, the price of getting my life back on track. "I think so," I admitted, but they said it was normal, that everyone recovers differently. "What you're seeing here," Dr. Hoffman said, gesturing to the screen, "is Asherman's syndrome. Intrauterine adhesions caused by uterine trauma, most commonly from surgical procedures. The scarring interferes with normal endometrial development and blood flow, making it extremely difficult to carry a pregnancy to term. Asherman's syndrome. Finally, a name for what had been destroying my life for 6 years. Finally, a medical explanation that connected my past choice to my present suffering in ways I'd suspected but never dared to voice. Can it be treated?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "We can try surgical intervention to remove some of the adhesions, but with scarring this extensive ... double quotes," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "The success rate for full-term pregnancy after treatment is quite low, maybe 15%, and that's being optimistic, 15%. After 6 losses, after years of hope and desperation and medical intervention, my chances of ever carrying a baby to term were 15%. The number felt both crushing and oddly appropriate, high enough to keep me hoping, low enough to ensure continued punishment. "There's something else," Dr. Hoffman said, and her tone had shifted to something more gentle, more personal. "I need you to understand that this condition doesn't develop overnight. The scarring pattern suggests the initial trauma occurred years ago, probably around the time of your termination. Every subsequent pregnancy attempt has likely worsened the adhesion, creating more scar tissue each time. Each pregnancy had made the next one less likely to succeed. Every loss had been building toward the next loss, creating an escalating cycle of failure that grew stronger with each attempt. The equation I'd been sensing for years was finally visible in medical terms. One choice made at 25 had set me on a path that made motherhood nearly impossible. Why didn't anyone catch this earlier? I asked. Asherman's syndrome is often missed on standard imaging. The adhesions can be subtle, and many doctors aren't specifically looking for it in cases of recurrent pregnancy loss. It requires direct visualization to diagnose definitively. 6 years of unexplained losses, 6 years of hope and heartbreak, 6 years of watching Thomas break a little more with each failure, all because no one had thought to look for evidence of a choice I'd made in a different lifetime when I was a different person who thought she knew what she wanted. That night, I sat in my empty house with Dr. Hoffman's report spread across my kitchen table, reading and rereading the clinical description of my condition. The medical terminology couldn't soften the brutal truth. I had permanently damaged my ability to have children in pursuit of a career that no longer brought me satisfaction, in service of a life that felt increasingly meaningless. The cosmic justice I'd been sensing for years wasn't cosmic at all. It was biological, mechanical, utterly predictable. I had broken something inside myself at 25, and it had taken 13 years for the consequences to be fully revealed. The punishment wasn't coming from some external force keeping score of my moral failures. It was written in my own damaged tissue, carved into the walls of my uterus. A permanent reminder of the choice that had seemed so simple and necessary at the time. And now I finally understood why every attempt to pay that debt had failed. You can't bargain with your own biology. You can't negotiate with scar tissue. You can't undo damage that's been building for more than a decade. Some choices really do follow you forever. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a process server who looked embarrassed to be interrupting my workday with legal documents that formalized the end of my marriage. Thomas had been thorough, irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution of assets, no request for alimony, clean, efficient, just like everything else he'd ever done. I signed them that same afternoon, sitting in my office with the door closed, using the same pen I'd used to sign off on marketing campaigns and budget approvals. My signature looked foreign on the legal documents, like it belonged to someone else entirely. In a way, it did. The woman who'd married Thomas had believed she deserved happiness, believed she could build a future on the ruins of her past. This woman knew better. The house felt different after that. Not just empty, but somehow accusatory. Every room held evidence of the life I'd tried to construct. The kitchen where Thomas had made coffee every morning. The living room where we'd planned our future. The nursery that had been painted and repainted for babies who would never sleep there. I walked through it like a ghost haunting my own existence. Work became my refuge again, the way it had been in my 20s. I threw myself into campaigns and client meetings, stayed late every night, came in early every morning. My colleagues probably thought I was handling the divorce well, channeling my energy into productivity. They had no idea I was running from the suffocating weight of truth, because now I knew. Not just suspected or feared, but knew with medical certainty that every loss had been connected to that choice I'd made at 25. The Asherman's syndrome wasn't punishment from some cosmic force. It was consequence, pure and simple. Cause and effect played out over 13 years, each failed pregnancy adding more scar tissue, making the next attempt even less likely to succeed. Dr. Hoffman had offered the surgical option, adhesion removal, that might give me that 15% chance of success. But sitting in her office, looking at the images of my damaged uterus, I'd declined. What was the point of surgery for a 15% chance when I was now 39, divorced, and emotionally bankrupt? What was the point of hoping when hope had become another form of self-torture? "Are you sure?" she'd ask. 15% isn't zero. Women have beaten longer odds, but I was sure. After 6 losses, after watching Thomas's break under the weight of grief I'd caused, after years of chasing miracles that would never come, I was finally ready to accept what my body had been trying to tell me all along. Some damage can't be undone. The finality of that acceptance should have brought peace. Instead, it brought a different kind of torment. The knowledge that I had done this to myself. Every tear Thomas had shed, every baby we'd buried, every hope we'd nurtured and watched die. It all traced back to a single decision I'd made in a white room when I thought I knew what I wanted from life. I started having dreams about her, the baby I'd never let be born. Not the fantasies of earlier years, but vivid, specific dreams where she had a face, a voice, a personality shaped by all the years I'd stolen from her. She was 13 in these dreams, the age she would have been now. With my dark hair and eyes that held a sadness she was too young to understand. "Why didn't you want me?" she'd ask in these dreams, and I'd try to explain about timing and careers and not being ready. But the words sounded hollow, even in excuses from a woman who'd prioritized abstract future goals over the life growing inside her. I was scared, I'd tell her. I was 25 and stupid, and I thought I had time to do everything over again later. "But you didn't," she'd say, with the devastating clarity that only exists in dreams. "You ran out of time, didn't you, Mommy?" I'd wake from these dreams gasping, my face wet with tears, my body aching with a grief that felt both ancient and immediate. During the day, I could maintain the fiction that my losses were medical bad luck, random tragedy that could happen to anyone. But at night, my subconscious forced me to face the truth. I had forfeited my right to motherhood 13 years ago. And everything since had been futile attempts to claim something I'd already thrown away. The worst part was the math. If I'd carried that first pregnancy to term, if I'd chosen differently at 25, I'd have a 13-year-old daughter now. I'd be the mother of a teenager, dealing with homework and boys and all the beautiful chaos of raising a child who was half-grown. Instead, I was approaching 40 with a damaged uterus and a marriage that had collapsed under the weight of repeatedly choosing hope over reality. My sister Diane called one evening in October, her voice bright with excitement. I no longer remembered how to feel. "I have news," she said. "We're pregnant again. Number 3, can you believe it?" I made the appropriate sounds of congratulation while something bitter and sharp twisted in my chest. Diane was 35, had gotten pregnant easily with both her previous children, took her fertility for granted the way people take breathing for granted. She had no idea what it cost to hear her casual joy. Her assumption that pregnancy led naturally to babies were due in May, she continued. "I know this has been hard for you, with everything you and Thomas went through. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, everything you and Thomas went through." As if our losses were something that had happened to us rather than something I'd caused. As if biology and bad luck were responsible rather than a choice I'd made before Thomas ever existed in my life. "I'm happy for you," I lied, because that's what sisters say. Because admitting that her good news felt like another form of punishment would reveal truths I wasn't ready to share. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in what had once been Sarah's nursery, surrounded by the evidence of all my failed attempts at motherhood. The crib Thomas had assembled with such hope, the mobile that had never spun above a sleeping baby, the rocking chair where I'd planned to nurse children who died before they could even cry. Diane would have her 3rd baby in May. Easy pregnancy, healthy delivery, probably another perfect child to add to her perfect family. And I would be 40 by then, alone in a house full of ghosts, finally understanding that some equations can't be solved and some debts can never be fully paid. The choice I'd made at 25 had felt so temporary, so icily erasable. A quick procedure, a few days of recovery, and life would return to normal. I'd had no idea I was trading away every future child, every chance at the family I thought I could plan and schedule like everything else in my carefully organized life. Now I knew better. Now I understood that normal was something I'd lost in that white room 13 years ago, along with my ability to create the life I'd thought I wanted. Some choices really do define everything that comes after. And some of us don't realize the price until it's far too late to pay it any differently. At 41, I made a decision that would have horrified the 25-year-old version of myself. I stopped trying. Not just to get pregnant, that ship had sailed years ago, but to maintain the careful facade I'd built around my professional life. my social relationships, my pretense that I was handling everything with grace and resilience. The breakdown started small, the way these things always do. Missed deadlines here and there, client meetings where I lost focus mid-presentation, staring at conference room walls while executives waited for responses that wouldn't come. My assistant, Jennifer, started covering for me with increasing frequency, making excuses about my heavy workload when I couldn't bring myself to return calls or finish projects that once would have energized me. "Are you okay, Marlene?" she asked one Thursday afternoon, finding me staring out my office window at the busy street below. I'd been watching people walk past for 2 hours, wondering about their lives, their families, their choices that had led them to this ordinary Tuesday that I couldn't seem to fully participate in. "I'm fine," I said, because that's what you say. Because admitting you're drowning in your corner office with the prestigious title and the view of Boston Harbor would sound like ingratitude to people who assumed success meant contentment. But I wasn't fine. I was barely functional, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly like performance art. Get up, shower, dress in the expensive suits that conveyed competence I no longer felt. Drive to the office, sit in meetings, nod at appropriate moments, make decisions about marketing strategies for products I didn't care about, sold to people who didn't matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everything I'd prioritized over that pregnancy at 25, the career, the independence, the carefully planned future, had become hollow, meaningless. The job that had once defined me now felt like an elaborate prison, trapping me in a life I'd built on the foundation of a choice that had cost me everything I actually wanted. My performance reviews, once stellar, started reflecting what everyone could see, but no one knew how to address. Lacks engagement with current projects, seems distracted during client presentations, may benefit from professional development opportunities to regain focus. Corporate speak for "what the hell happened to you?" I knew what had happened. I'd finally run out of energy to maintain the lie that my life was working, that my choices had led me to where I was supposed to be. 16 years after that Saturday morning in the White Room, I was finally facing the full cost of what I'd traded away. The panic attacks returned with a vengeance, hitting at random moments with the force of physical assault. Standing in line at the grocery store, I'd suddenly be 25 again, sitting in that waiting room, surrounded by other women making the same choice, feeling my heart race with the weight of a decision I couldn't unmake. Driving home from work, I'd have to pull over, gasping for air in parking lots while strangers walked past my car, probably wondering why a well-dressed woman was falling apart behind her steering wheel. Sleep became elusive, then impossible. I'd lie awake calculating years: 16 since the abortion, 6 since my first miscarriage, 3 since Thomas left. The numbers felt significant, weighted with meaning I couldn't escape. 16 years of consequences for a choice that had taken less than an hour to... My sister noticed first. Diane called less frequently now that she was managing 3 young children. But when she did, her voice carried the careful concern of someone trying to navigate a minefield. "You sound tired," she said during one of our brief conversations. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "Taking care of myself." As if self-care could solve what ailed me. As if yoga classes and therapy sessions could undo the fundamental equation that had been governing my life for 16 years. 1 terminated pregnancy plus 6 miscarriages equaled a woman who'd forfeited her right to happiness. "I'm fine," I lied, because the truth was too complicated to explain. How could I tell my sister, who'd effortlessly produced 3 healthy children, that I was suffocating under the weight of choices I'd made before I understood their consequences? The job became impossible to maintain. Client presentations turned into exercises in barely controlled panic. I'd stand in conference rooms trying to remember why anyone cared about market share and demographic targeting, while my body remembered white rooms and humming machines, and the sound of Thomas crying over babies that would never come home. My supervisor, Michael, called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in November. He was younger than me, had gotten his MBA while I was losing pregnancy after pregnancy, had climbed the corporate ladder while I was drowning in grief disguised as ambition. "Marlene, "We need to talk about your performance," he said. And his voice held the uncomfortable authority of someone forced to address a problem he didn't understand. "Your work has been inconsistent lately. Clients have noticed. I've noticed." I sat across from his desk, looking at this man who'd never lost a child. Never sat in hospital waiting rooms counting heartbeats that would stop too soon. Never signed divorce papers because grief had made love impossible. What could I possibly say that would make him understand? "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I'll do better." But we both knew I was lying. Whatever better looked like, I didn't have access to it anymore. The woman who'd once thrived on deadlines and client demands had been replaced by someone who could barely remember why any of it mattered. "Maybe you should consider taking some time," Michael suggested. "Personal leave or ... double quotes. He paused, searching for diplomatic language. Maybe this isn't the right fit anymore. He was offering me an exit, disguised as concern. A way to leave without being fired. To maintain some dignity while acknowledging what we both knew. I was broken in ways that made me unsuitable for the career I'd once sacrificed everything to build. I cleaned out my office that afternoon, packing 16 years of accumulated success into cardboard boxes that felt surprisingly light. Awards, client appreciation letters, photos from company events where I'd smiled for cameras while carrying the weight of loss no one could see. Driving home with my professional life in boxes, I thought about that 25-year-old woman who'd been so certain she was making the right choice. She'd believed success would compensate for sacrifice. That career achievement would fill whatever emptiness followed difficult decisions. She'd had no idea that emptiness could grow, could metastasize, could eventually consume everything she'd built on its foundation. She'd never imagined that 16 years later, she'd be leaving her corner office not in triumph, but in defeat, carrying the accumulated weight of choices that had seemed so manageable at the time. At 41, I was unemployed, unmarried, and finally forced to confront the truth I'd been avoiding for 16 years. Some prices are too high to pay. And some of us don't realize it until the bill comes due in ways we never anticipated. The career I'd protected by terminating that pregnancy was over. The marriage I'd lost through repeated miscarriages was finished. Everything I'd thought I wanted at 25 had turned to dust in my hands. And for the first time since that Saturday morning in the White Room, I had nowhere left to run from the truth of what I'd done. Without work to structure my days, time became elastic, meaningless. Hours stretched into each other, unmarked by meetings or deadlines or any sense of purpose. I'd wake up at noon, if I slept at all, and find myself still in the same position at midnight, staring at walls that held no answers to questions I couldn't even articulate anymore. The house, which had once felt too empty, now felt suffocating. Every room contained evidence of lives I'd tried and failed to build. The marriage that had crumbled under the weight of repeated loss. The children who'd never made it past the first trimester. The career that had finally rejected me after 16 years of giving it everything I had. I stopped answering the phone. Diane called less and less frequently as her messages went unreturned. A few former colleagues reached out in the beginning, making polite inquiries about my sabbatical, offering to meet for coffee or lunch. I let their calls go to voicemail, deleted their texts unread. What was the point of pretending I was taking time to regroup when the truth was I was disintegrating? The money wouldn't last forever. Severance pay and savings accumulated over years of working 60-hour weeks, back when I'd believed success was something you could bank and withdraw when needed. But watching my account balance decline each month felt oddly fitting, like the universe was systematically stripping away everything I'd built on the foundation of that choice made at 25. I started spending my days in strange ways, driving aimlessly through neighborhoods where families lived, parking outside elementary schools to watch children play during recess. These weren't my children, could never be my children, but watching them run and laugh and exist in the world felt like glimpsing a parallel universe where I'd made different choices. Sometimes I'd imagine her there among them, the daughter I'd never allowed to be born. She'd be 17 now, almost ready for college, probably beautiful and complicated, and full of the kind of dreams I'd once had at her age. I'd picture her playing soccer or reading under a tree, living the life I'd stolen from both of us that morning in the White Room. The guilt wasn't new. I'd carried it for 17 years, like a stone in my chest. But now, with nothing left to distract me from its weight, it became unbearable. I'd lie in bed at 3 in the morning, calculating the mathematics of loss. 1 abortion, plus 6 miscarriages, plus 1 failed marriage, plus 1 destroyed career, equaled a woman who'd systematically demolished every chance at happiness she'd been given. My appearance started reflecting what I felt inside. The expensive suits stayed in the closet, replaced by sweatpants and t-shirts I'd wear for days at a time. My hair grew past my shoulders, unwashed and unkempt. I lost weight without trying, forgetting to eat while I sat in my kitchen staring at the refrigerator magnets Thomas had left, behind cheerful reminders of the life we'd tried to build before it all collapsed. The panic attacks intensified, triggered by increasingly random things. The sound of children laughing, commercials for baby products, pregnant women in grocery stores, their hands resting unconsciously on their growing bellies. Each trigger sent me spiraling back to that White Room, to the sound of that machine, to the moment I'd traded away everything I didn't realize I wanted. I tried therapy once, sitting across from Dr. Walsh, a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in grief counseling. She had photos of her own children on her desk, teenagers with bright smiles and whole futures ahead of them, and I spent most of our session staring at those pictures, wondering what it felt like to watch your children grow instead of burying them. "Tell me about your losses," she said during our first session, and the clinical language felt like sandpaper on my soul. Losses, as if my babies had been misplaced rather than mourned. As if the connection between my choice at 25 and my failures at 35 was just coincidence rather than consequence. "I had 6 miscarriages," I said, because that was the acceptable version of the truth. The version that painted me as victim rather than architect of my own suffering. "That must have been incredibly difficult," Dr. Walsh said, and her voice held the practiced compassion of someone who'd guided many people through similar grief. "Have you been able to process the trauma of those experiences?" Trauma. Another clinical word that missed the mark entirely. Trauma implied something that had been done to me, something beyond my control. But sitting in her office, looking at pictures of children who'd been allowed to live, I knew the truth was more complicated and infinitely more damning. "I think I caused them," I said suddenly, the words escaping before I could stop them. Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly. "Caused them how?" And there it was. The moment where I could have told the truth, could have admitted that every loss traced back to a choice I'd made in a different lifetime when I thought I knew what I wanted. Could have explained about the Asherman's syndrome, about the scar tissue that made pregnancy impossible, about the direct line connecting my terminated pregnancy to every baby I'd buried afterward. Instead, I said nothing. Because admitting the truth would mean accepting responsibility not just for my own suffering, but for Thomas's, for every tear he'd shed over children who'd died because I'd damaged my ability to carry them. It would mean acknowledging that 16 years of pain could have been avoided if I'd made a different choice that Saturday morning when I was 25 and stupid and so certain I knew what my future should look like. I stopped going to therapy after 3 sessions. Dr. Walsh's gentle probing and carefully worded questions felt like torture when I couldn't bring myself to reveal the source of my guilt. How could she help me heal from trauma when the real trauma was the knowledge that I'd caused all my own suffering? By winter, I was barely leaving the house. Groceries got delivered, bills got paid automatically, and I existed in a kind of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor able to imagine an ending to the pain. The house grew cold and dark, mirrors of my internal landscape. I stopped turning on lights during the day, stopped opening curtains, stopped pretending there was any point to maintaining the facade of a functioning life. This was rock bottom, I thought. 42 years old, alone in a house full of ghosts, unemployed and unemployable, carrying the weight of choices that had seemed so manageable at 25. This was what that confident young woman had bought with her quick fix. Her efficient solution, her belief that some decisions could be made without consequences. But I was wrong about rock bottom. Rock bottom, I would learn, was still coming. Rock bottom was the phone call I'd receive in 6 months. The diagnosis that would reveal just how much deeper the consequences of that choice could go. For now, I just sat in my dark house, counting the cost of decisions I couldn't unmake, waiting for whatever punishment the universe had left to deliver. Because after 17 years, I'd finally learned that some equations never balance. Some debts keep growing no matter how much you pay. And some choices follow you all the way to the end, demanding interest you never knew you'd agreed to pay. The call came on a Thursday morning in March when I was 43 and had been living like a ghost in my own house for almost 2 years. I'd been bleeding irregularly for months, not the familiar bleedings of lost pregnancies, but something different, heavier, accompanied by pain that felt like my body was finally giving up its long fight against the damage I'd caused. I'd been avoiding doctors since my last meeting with Dr. Hoffman, the one who'd finally diagnosed the Asherman syndrome that connected every loss to that choice I'd made at 25. What was the point of medical intervention when the problem wasn't medical, but existential? When the issue wasn't broken biology, but a broken soul? But the bleeding had become impossible to ignore, soaking through overnight pads in a matter of hours, leaving me weak and dizzy. Even in my state of deliberate self-neglect, some survival instinct finally kicked in. I called Dr. Morrison's office, the gynecologist who'd delivered so many devastating diagnoses over the years, and made an appointment I'd been dreading. "Marlene," she said when she saw me in her office, and I could see her shock at my appearance. I'd lost 30 pounds, my clothes hung loose, and my skin had the gray pallor of someone who'd spent too long avoiding sunlight and hope in equal measure. "How long has this bleeding been going on?" "A few months," I admitted, though it felt longer. Time had become fluid in my isolated existence, days blending into weeks, without the anchor of routine or purpose. The examination was thorough, uncomfortable, accompanied by the kind of concerned murmuring that meant Dr. Morrison was seeing something that worried her. She ordered blood work, an ultrasound, a biopsy that required me to return the following week and submit to more, poking and prodding while she extracted tissue from my damaged uterus. "I'll have the results in a few days," she said as I got dressed, moving slowly like an old woman, though I was only 43. "Try not to worry too much. Try not to worry." As if worry were something I could control, something I could turn on and off like a faucet. As if I hadn't been drowning in worry for 18 years. Ever since that Saturday morning when I'd thought I was solving a problem instead of creating a lifetime's worth of them. The call came while I was sitting in what had once been Sarah's nursery, surrounded by the evidence of all my failed attempts at redemption. The crib that had never held a baby, the mobile that had never spun above a sleeping child, the rocking chair where I'd planned to nurse children back to health, but had instead rocked myself through waves of grief that never seemed to end. "Marlene, this is Dr. Morrison." Her voice was gentler than usual, carrying the careful tone medical professionals use when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. "Could you come in this afternoon? I'd like to discuss your test results in person." In person, never a good sign. Good news gets delivered over the phone with congratulations and relief. Bad news requires face-to-face meetings, tissues on the table, careful explanations of treatment options, and survival I drove to her office through the bright March afternoon, past families walking together, past children playing in parks, past pregnant women who took their ability to create life for granted. The irony of it all felt like a cosmic joke. Here I was, about to receive what I already knew would be devastating news, surrounded by evidence of the fertility I'd thrown away, and then spent years desperately trying to reclaim. Dr. Morrison's office felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as I sat across from her desk while she arranged papers and prepared to deliver whatever verdict my body had finally reached after years of abuse and neglect. "The biopsy results came back," she said, meeting my eyes with the direct compassion of someone who'd guided me through too many losses to count. "I'm afraid it's cancer, Marlene, Endometrial cancer. Cancer. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and finality. Cancer of the uterus, the organ that had failed me so spectacularly, that had been damaged by my choice at 25, and had spent 18 years trying to heal itself. While I kept asking it to perform miracles, it was no longer capable of. Stage 3, Dr. Morrison continued, and her voice seemed to come from very far away. It's more advanced than I'd hoped, but we caught it before it spread beyond the uterine wall. With aggressive treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, possibly radiation, the 5-year survival rate is quite good. 5-year survival rate. More medical terminology that felt abstract when applied to my own crumbling existence. What was the point of surviving 5 more years when I'd barely been living for the past 2? What was the point of fighting for a life that felt more like an extended punishment than a gift worth preserving? The irony isn't lost on me, I heard myself say, and Dr. Morrison looked confused. Cancer in the organ I've spent 18 years destroying. First with a choice I made at 25, then with 6 pregnancies that couldn't survive the damage I'd caused. And now with neglect and despair and whatever toxic combination of guilt and grief does to your body when you carry it long. Enough. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. Marlene, what choice are you talking about? What damage? And suddenly it was all spilling out, 18 years of secrets I'd carried alone. The truth I'd never told Thomas. The connection between my terminated pregnancy and every loss that followed. For the Asherman's syndrome, Dr. Hoffman had diagnosed the scar tissue that had made motherhood impossible. The direct line from that white room at 25 to this office at 43, where I was being told my damaged uterus was now trying to kill me. Dr. Morrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her professional demeanor intact even as I confessed to years of self-deception and willful blindness to the consequences of my choices. The Asherman's syndrome wouldn't have caused the cancer, she said when I finished. These are separate conditions, separate issues. But I knew better. Maybe the medical connections weren't direct, but the emotional and spiritual ones were undeniable. 18 years of guilt and grief and self-punishment had culminated in my body finally giving up, finally succumbing to the toxicity I'd been carrying since that Saturday morning when I'd thought I could make a choice without consequences. What if I don't want treatment? I asked, and Dr. Morrison's expression shifted from professional concern to something more personal. Marlene, you're 43 years old. With treatment, you could have decades of life ahead of you. Decades of life. Doing what? Living where? Surrounded by whom? ID systematically destroyed every relationship, every career prospect, every source of meaning or purpose. What was the point of extending an existence that felt more like an elaborate form of self-torture than actual living? I need time to think, I said, though I already knew what I was going to decide. This cancer felt less like a disease and more like a final accounting. The universe's way of concluding the equation that had been building for 18 years. 1 terminated pregnancy, plus 6 miscarriages, plus 1 destroyed marriage, plus 1 ruined career, plus 18 years of guilt and grief equaled a woman whose body had finally stopped trying to heal itself and started trying to die instead. For the first time in years, the math made perfect sense. I didn't tell anyone about the diagnoses for 2 weeks. The house grew even quieter, if that was possible, as I moved through my days carrying this new knowledge like another stone added to the collection I'd been accumulating for 18 years. Cancer. The word felt both foreign and familiar, like something I'd been expecting without realizing it. The treatment plan Dr. Morrison had outlined sat on my kitchen counter, still in its manila envelope. Hysterectomy followed by chemotherapy, radiation if the pathology showed spread beyond what they could see. A roadmap for fighting a disease that felt less like an invasion and more like a natural conclusion to choices I'd made nearly 2 decades ago. But I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said, that I could have decades of life ahead of me. The idea felt absurd, impossible. What would I do with decades? I was 43, unemployed, unmarried, estranged from most of my family by my own withdrawal from the world. I had no friends left after years of declining invitations and ignoring phone calls. The life I'd built on the foundation of that choice at 25 had crumbled so completely that I wasn't even sure there was a person left worth saving. The irony was suffocating. For 6 years, I'd fought desperately to create life, to carry a pregnancy to term, to become the mother I'd thought I could postpone indefinitely. Now, faced with a disease that was systematically destroying the organ I damaged in pursuit of career goals that had ultimately meant nothing. I don't find the will to fight for my own survival. My sister's call came on a rainy Thursday evening. I'd been screening her calls for months, but something made me answer that night. Maybe it was the cancer making me sentimental. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying so many secrets for so long. Marlene? Diane's voice carried surprise that I'd actually picked up. I was starting to think you'd changed your number. I'm here, I said, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. Some essential part of me had been absent for years, lost somewhere in the white room where this whole cascade of consequences had begun. I'm worried about you, she said. Mom is worried. You never call anymore. You didn't come to Christmas, and when I drove by your house last week, it looked like no one was living there. My house probably did look abandoned. I'd stopped maintaining the facade of normal living months ago. The lawn was overgrown, mail piled up on the front porch, newspapers accumulated in the driveway. From the outside, it probably looked like the residence of someone who'd given up on life entirely, which wasn't far from the truth. I'm fine, I said, because it was easier than explaining that fine was a concept I no longer had access to. That fine had been stolen from me 18 years ago, along with my ability to trust my own judgment, to believe I deserved happiness, to imagine a future that didn't feel like an extended punishment. You're not fine, Marlene. Whatever happened with Thomas, whatever's going on with work, people get divorced, people change careers. You can't just disappear from your own life. But that's exactly what I'd done, wasn't it? I'd disappeared so gradually that even I hadn't noticed until I was completely gone, replaced by this hollow shell of a woman who moved through the motions of existence without feeling connected to any of it. There's something I need to tell you, I heard myself say. And suddenly, the words were pouring out, not just about the cancer, but about everything. The abortion at 25, the 6 miscarriages that followed, the Asherman syndrome that connected my choice to every loss, the diagnoses that felt like a final punctuation mark on 18 years of consequences. Diane was quiet for a long time after I finished, and I could hear her children in the background, the sounds of a normal family living a normal life, the kind of life I'd traded away for career ambitions that had ultimately left me empty and alone. Jesus, Marlene, she finally said, why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you carry all this alone? Why? Because admitting it would make it real. Because saying it out loud would mean accepting that my suffering wasn't random misfortune, but the predictable result of a choice I'd made when I thought I knew what I wanted from life. Because confession would mean taking responsibility not just for my own pain, but for Thomas's, for every tear he'd shed over babies who'd died because of damage I'd caused years before I met him. I thought I could handle it, I said. I thought I could fix it, or at least outlast it. I thought if I just tried hard enough, worked hard enough, wanted it badly enough, I could somehow undo what I'd done. But that's not how life works, Diane said gently. You can't undo choices. You can only live with them and try to move forward. Move forward. The phrase felt like a foreign concept, something that belonged to people who hadn't spent 18 years moving in circles, chasing redemption that always stayed just out of reach. I don't know how, I admitted. I don't know how to move forward when everything I've tried to build has collapsed, when every choice I've made has led to more pain, more loss, more evidence that I don't deserve the things I thought I wanted. You do deserve them, Diane said. But her voice carried the hollow ring of words people say because they're supposed to, not because they necessarily believe them. You deserve love, happiness, a future. The cancer doesn't change that. But the cancer did change everything, didn't it? It was the final piece of the equation, the last variable that made the math of my life finally add up to something approaching justice. One terminated pregnancy plus 18 years of consequences equaled a woman whose body had stopped trying to heal and started trying to die instead. "I'm not sure I want to fight it," I said, and I heard Diane's sharp intake of breath. "Don't say that. Don't even think that. Why?" The question came out harder than I'd intended. What am I fighting for? What kind of life am I supposed to preserve? I'm 43, alone, unemployed, and I've systematically destroyed every relationship I've ever had. I've spent 18 years trying to atone for one choice, and all I've accomplished is proving that some mistakes can't be fixed. They can be forgiven, though, Diane said, by other people, and eventually by yourself. Forgiveness. Another foreign concept, something that belonged to people who hadn't spent nearly 2 decades carrying the weight of consequences that kept multiplying, keep growing, kept demanding payment in ways I'd never anticipated. I wanted to believe her. Part of me, some small, stubborn part that had survived 18 years of guilt and grief, wanted to believe that forgiveness was possible, that redemption was something I could still reach. But sitting in my dark house, surrounded by the evidence of all my failures, facing a disease that felt like the natural conclusion to choices made in a white room when I was young and stupid, and so certain I knew what the future should look like, forgiveness felt as impossible as the pregnancies I'd spent years trying to achieve. Some debts, I was learning, are too heavy to forgive. Some choices follow you all the way to the end, demanding interest that compounds until it consumes everything you thought you had left to give. And some of us, no matter how much we want to believe otherwise, simply run out of time to make it right. I'm sitting in the same chair where this story began, in Dr. Patterson's office, 6 months after my conversation with Diane. The manila envelope containing my treatment plan remains unopened on my kitchen counter, gathering dust like everything else in my life I've chosen to ignore. The cancer has spread, just as I knew it would. Dr. Patterson's voice is gentle but clear. Stage 4 now, metastasized beyond what surgery and chemotherapy could reasonably address. The 5-year survival rate he mentions sounds like statistics for someone else's life, not mine. With aggressive palliative care, we could potentially extend your life significantly, he says. But I hear the careful language, the medical euphemisms for buying time rather than saving lives. How long without treatment? I ask, because that's the only timeline that matters now. Months, he says. Maybe 6, maybe less. It's hard to predict exactly. 6 months to finish paying a debt that's been accumulating for 19 years. 6 months to face what I've spent nearly 2 decades trying to outrun, outwork, outhope. It feels almost generous, this final deadline. More time than I gave my daughter at 25, when I decided her existence was inconvenient to the life I thought I wanted. I drive home through streets filled with people living normal lives, people who made different choices, who found ways to build families and careers without destroying their ability to have either. The spring afternoon is beautiful, the kind of day that should inspire hope or gratitude or some recognition of life's inherent value. Instead, I feel nothing but the weight of mathematical certainty. 1 abortion plus 6 miscarriages, plus 1 destroyed marriage, plus 1 ruined career, plus 19 years of guilt and grief equals a woman whose body has finally given up trying to heal itself. At home, I call Diane. She answers on the first ring, like she's been waiting. It's spread, I tell her, because there's no point in gentle approaches anymore. Stage 4, maybe 6 months. The silence stretches between us, filled with all the conversations we should have had years ago. All the truths I should have shared before it was too late for them to matter. Fight it, she says finally, but her voice carries the hollow ring of desperation rather than conviction. Please, Marlene, fight it. For what? I ask. So I can live another 5 years alone in this house, carrying the same guilt, making the same calculations about choices I can never unmake? So I can spend whatever time I have left pretending that some lives are worth living when the evidence suggests otherwise? For the possibility that it could get better? That you could find peace or purpose, or I had my chance at peace. I interrupt. I had multiple chances. I chose career over motherhood at 25, thinking I could have both later. I chose hope over reality through 6 miscarriages, thinking I could somehow cheat the consequences of that first choice. I chose isolation over honesty for years, thinking I could carry the weight of what I'd done without destroying everything around me. Each choice had seemed reasonable at the time. Each decision had felt like the best available option given my circumstances, my knowledge, my desperate need to believe that some equations could be solved through effort and determination. But reasonable choices, I've learned, don't always lead to reasonable outcomes. And some debts grow larger no matter how much you pay, demanding interest that compounds until it consumes everything you thought you had left to give. The irony isn't lost on me. Dying of cancer in the organ I damaged, pursuing a life that turned out to be meaningless anyway. The uterus that couldn't carry my children to term is now carrying the disease that will end my life. There's a symmetry to it that feels almost poetic, if poetry could be written in scar tissue and malignant cells. I think about her sometimes, the daughter I never let be born. She would be 19 now, maybe in college, maybe studying to be a doctor or a teacher or whatever passion had captured her imagination. She might have had children of her own someday, grandchildren I'll never meet, because I decided at 25 that her existence was inconvenient to my timeline. The guilt over that choice doesn't feel sharp anymore. It's been worn smooth by years of carrying it, like a stone polished by constant handling. What remains isn't the cutting edge of fresh regret, but the dull, constant ache of loss that can never be recovered. Time that can never be reclaimed, love that was never allowed to exist. Would things have been different if I'd made another choice that Saturday morning 19 years ago? Would I be sitting in a different doctor's office, maybe accompanying my teenage daughter to a college interview, or celebrating her first job, or planning her wedding? Would the woman I became have been happier, more complete, more deserving of the life she was given? I'll never know. That's the cruelest mathematics of all. Some equations can never be solved because the variables were eliminated before we understood their value. The treatment pamphlets Dr. Patterson gave me will join the unopened envelope on my kitchen counter. 6 months feels like enough time to finish dying the way I've been living, quietly, alone, carrying the weight of choices that seemed so manageable when I made them. This isn't a story about redemption or healing or finding peace at the end. This is a story about consequences, about the price of decisions we make when we think we have unlimited time to correct our mistakes. This is a testimony for women who think they can postpone the things that matter most without losing them entirely. Some choices follow you forever. Some debts keep growing no matter how much you pay. And some of us learned too late that the life we thought we wanted was built on the foundation of everything we actually needed. My name is Marlene, and this was the price I had to pay for believing I could control my destiny without accepting responsibility for the life I was already carrying. This was my punishment for thinking some decisions could be made without permanent consequence. The cancer isn't my punishment. It's just the final statement on an account that's been overdue for 19 years. The punishment was living long enough to understand exactly what I'd traded away and why it could never be reclaimed.